Well, welcome. It's great to have you here at the start of another week and for the final week in this webinar series. But it's been just wonderful to spend some time together, and I've been so gratified. Thank you with the comments and the questions that have been coming through. It's been terrific to tackle some of the questions you have about not only using Writer's Toolbox, but also teaching well, educating well in this situation of distance learning and remote learning, and how you might do that effectively in the classroom. At the end of last week, I said that we concluded the week with a final session on essays. And I also said, as we began to look a little bit at question design, that we should do some more on this. Today is that day. I'd like to spend a little bit of time looking at the nature of question design, giving you a few tips as a teacher, as an educator, that how you might do this well for the sake of your students. It's so important. I said last week, and I meant it, if you think about the things that you possess as a teacher with which to manage and challenge your classroom, often the quality of the questions you ask is the first weapon in your toolbox. You ask quality questions and you'll train sharper, better thinking from your students. So how do you do this? How do you do it orally as a teacher, but also how do you do it in the written form so that the student knows exactly what to do, which direction to go, and also that that question possesses the requisite degree of challenge so the student isn't switched off or bored or in some way lowered in their ability to perform by the quality of the questions we asked. So let's look at this. And from the outset, let me give you a number of tips about question design. Here we go. Here's the first one. And I think number one is always, and I've said it earlier in the week, and I say it again anywhere really, number one, it's very important that you produce detailed resources. I'm a big fan, as I said right from the beginning of this webinar series, of actually the teacher generated workbook. You know your students, you know the level, the capacity, you know their ability to assimilate information and digest that and reproduce it. And so often we can either undershoot or overshoot the mark if we go and find either material that's too hard for them or material that is just too vacuous. It doesn't have the requisite detail with which to help the student answer the question. So you create them. I think you do a great job. It doesn't need to be many pages long. Often it could just be 1 or 2 pages long, but you do it. Make it visual, make it creative. And often many things can be driven just by something that's even 1 or 2 sides long. In many cases, that will be sufficient. Well-written text, precise, you could do it. Here's number 2. Number 2. Note to self, stop going back and forwards between equipment so quickly, it doesn't like it. The most focused question will always produce better quality answers. If you want good quality answers from your students, write focused questions. not fluffy, waffly things that the person doesn't really know the direction in which they're meant to go. And especially positionally, they can't respond in either the affirmative or the negative, and they do not feel they have something tangibly to respond to. The question has to have teeth and a keen focus to work well in the classroom. Here's number 3. And you're going to love this. You write the answer. You want good quality questions. You write that quality answer you want to see first. And then often, I think as we do this, we're surprised. We find that actually the question I originally conceived in my head will not produce that answer that I just wrote that I knew I wanted. It's a wonderful opportunity as a teacher, as us, to self-reflect and think, oh gosh, yes, I need to amend the question to actually get that sort of answer. You'll never know it unless you actually write it yourself. And number 4, I think, and this is important, questions themselves are an act of communication. And they are. They're not just a question. They're a piece of communication. And we have in our hands as teachers the opportunity to either fluff that or get it right. And communication can often have just way too much noise. To be a good piece of communication, you need to do several things. And you can probably sense this already. Several things. Here we go. Question, communication. One is, and I challenge you about this, and it's a good challenge. One is this: the less words, the better. If you cannot cast a question in less than 60 words, you probably haven't thought about it enough. In fact, as you get good at this, you should be able to cast a question in less than 40 words. That's basically 2 sentences. That will force you, the teacher, the examiner, the educator, to really think through what it is you actually want the person to answer. And we're the ones who have to do this thinking, not the students. We're the ones who need to do this thinking. So here's number 3. Layout. And I'll show you some examples about this in a second. But it's not just filling the space with words. It's also thinking about images. That's important. Actually, often, especially with boys. But images themselves tell a story. And the second is your use of white space. In communication theory, we often talk about noise. Noise in a document or in communication, we'll talk about the document for a second, is elements that have been introduced on purpose to distract someone. It can be far too detailed information or the wrong information. It can be just that the document is cluttered. And as a result, as an effective piece of communication, where the receiver needs to be able to understand the true message the communicator is actually trying to get across, it suffers. Why? Because there is far too much noise present in that piece of communication. So thinking about your use of white space, what don't you put on the page, is important in question design. And decluttering is vital These students need it. They have enough clutter in their lives. Our job as teachers to get this right. So without further ado, let me show you a couple of examples of things that have got right for teachers and things that have gone completely wrong. And then we'll work through one and we'll talk about this and see how you might actually throw some alternatives and then throw some alternatives in Writer's Toolbox. So what I have for you, and I'd like to share my screen again, is I'll show you a couple of questions that have been written by and used frequently, especially in secondary school education. Now, the context may be not completely familiar with you, but the approach I'm sure will be. So have a look. You may recognize something like this. You may have seen one floating around your staff room. You may have done one and don't want to confess to it, but we'll see. Here's one, and against the very attractive backdrop of Writer's Toolbox, have you seen something like this recently? And yes, I can see a few hands going up. Here we have a level 2 assessment task in New Zealand. This is a PE task. Lucky you. And this is what the students were handed out. Lucky them. At your average high school. Now remember, these kids are level 2, they're not university students, they're high school students. They have the normal challenges and excitement and that high school students possess. And then on a rainy Tuesday morning, you're handed this. Well, you get examine the significance for self, others, and society of a sporting event, physical activity, or festival. The first thing you think, of course, because your name is Nigel and you do have half a brain, is you think, couldn't the idiot make their mind up in the first place? And Nigel's correct, the idiot couldn't. So we carry on. And then we have the first page with 3 possibilities. Nigel reads this, he turns to page 2, and he sees some more guff about the assessment required that he has to do. And he says he could take part in physical activity, requires him to take part, and he has to examine the significance, and he carries on. His presentation may be in the form of a seminar, which could be video clips, audio clips, PowerPoint slides, or a photo montage. It could be a documentary. He might make a movie. He could use his teacher's voice, his parents' voice, his cat's voice. He might write a letter, an article, or a sports magazine. Of course, if he writes a letter, he will fail, but he doesn't know that. He could write a written report, a debate with a dialogue. And by this stage, Nigel is feeling exhausted, but he's only on page 2, and he carries on because he's a tough young man. He's learnt perseverance. And he moves ahead. Conditions. Oh no, more about the task, says Nigel. He has to select it. Then he should involve himself. And of course, it could be anything from Zumba, which he'd like to go to, but he hasn't really the physical prowess. So instead he plays the local chess team, but he carries on. And he could talk to his family, his friends, his whānau about the activity. What would they know, says Nigel, but he might. And then he could research it. Well, of course, Nigel here is thinking, I thought I was only in level 2 at high school. I didn't know I was embarking on my thesis. This is feeling like one, but he carries on. And then at last, on about page 4 we are now, he finds a useful set of resources. Now, of course, this is Nigel. He's he's about 16 and a half. His reading age, because he's been struggling, is about 12, but he's pursuing this. And he's found these useful resources. And then he hits this. To prepare his presentation, he might do these things. He could support it, he could explain it, and then he carries on, because that's all quite useful, he says, after he's got through that, the pros and cons, the opportunities. Nigel is feeling bombarded by questions. And then he turns to this page, and he finds another set of 12 possible questions that he might answer in his presentation. And Nigel, quite rightly now, is thinking, what idiot wrote this in the first place? Could they just not give me a question? And Nigel is correct. It's not Nigel's fault, it's our fault. Because he turns the page and he finds this. More educational gobbledygook, written by an accountant, I suspect. And another one, not one, but 2 pages. And just for a good measure, a 3rd page and a bit more. Not only has the school killed 9 trees and 3 photocopying assistants in the process, but Nigel, who actually enrolled in PE because he loved sport and wanted to be a coach or a gym instructor, is feeling, I should have done English. Why did I pick this? Nigel is, of course, correct. But it's not his fault, it's our fault. Who would do that to a student? The one thing that entire document does not actually even include, because it's the first question that Nigel will ask when he puts his hand up, is how many words do you want? And it's not in that 3,125 words at all. Not even the extent of the task that Nigel's meant to perform. We must stand up to our duty as teachers. The child, the student, deserves a concrete answer at this point in time. They need to know how many words, how many pages are required to do this task, to pass or to get a requisite grade. That's not rocket science. It's not a deep mystery known only by the caretaker and 3 people in the senior office. It's just basic education. Tell him, work it out, write it yourself. These things are our duty, not Nigel's to fumble with, because here's what he could have actually seen, or something like it. Instead of that nonsense, Nigel could have been handed this. A single page identifying what Nigel actually needs to do, how many words he has to write, how many pages that is, and where he should spend his words. The explicit focus of every section, of every piece of work that Nigel might undertake. And you could even make this more beneficial for Nigel, because I suspect you as the teacher, if you do something like this, and it doesn't matter if you teach history, English, PE, or motorcycle studies, you will already know which are the better topics to pick and which are not, which there is a requisite amount of scholarly material demanded at the particular level the student is working at, and for which there just is not. And the student will flounder and end up writing a lot of their own opinion, and as a result, will never demonstrate critical analysis. So we must be careful as teachers. Good question design is our territory. It's the bit that we need to master for the benefit of our students. So let's do one more as we think about this, and I hope this is helpful. I hope this is useful. But this is when I said those 4 things. You know, the less words, the better. You don't need 3,125 words, which was example 1. You should be able to contain even a large piece of work like I have here, and where you want scaffolded directions in no more than one side of one piece of paper. We should never, the moment we go over more than one side of one piece of paper as a teacher for a question, we have failed. We have failed the first thing. Is it concise and is it clear? No, it's not. We're waffling. So work for our students. Is this question in 40 words or less? No, it's not. It's a question where the school, the task, wanted additional scaffolding. Can you write that question in 40 words or less? You bet you can. And actually, it would be a better question. But many of you work in assessment regimes where they want this. Actually, the sad thing is, if we do, and I think this is the opportunity for primary school teachers listening right now, I hope you embrace my earlier suggestions to teach themes in the early years of primary school, because actually a child by the time they attain their first year at high school, should be walking into high school and not need that level of scaffolding. That's actually an indictment on us. They should already know how to tackle a task of, of that sort of length analytically and well. So when they've hit their first year, they can do 500-600 words, moving quickly through to 700 words, and they know how to demonstrate analysis, and they can do it from a 40-word question. But we haven't trained them enough. So your opportunity is to do more things. Foster that positional, teach those synthetic skills that we talked about earlier. You can do it, and they'll benefit. So let's do another one, and I'll show you how you can sort of evolve these questions to get to where you need to go. So let's go. We'll jump into, we'll go to the portion of the screen again, please. We'll get rid of that, and we'll get rid of that hideous things, and we'll jump into Writer's Toolbox. And I'll just, I'll write one. This may be familiar to something that you may or may not have seen in a movie near you, but this is going to be like watching paint dry. I'll tell a joke. No, I won't. This is a question, of course. This has been used in examinations in New Zealand. I pity you if you got the same question in Australia, but we'll hope you haven't. Explain why being able to relate to the character or individual was important. You can tell I'm typographically challenged to the novel as a whole. I hope you never see or have to do a question like that in your life. There it is. Let's just make it hideous. Okay, what's wrong with that question? Well, a number of things. Watch this. If a question is meant to be a exercise in clarity for a student, we just dropped off at the first hurdle. Because watch this. What does that say right there? Yep, at least one character or individual. And in part 2 of this question, what does it say? Yep, you got it. The character or individual. The question already is loaded with errors. It's meant to be, if you write about multiple characters or individuals across your 600 words, will you do well at this question? No, you never will at all. Why? Because you spread yourself far too thinly. The student who goes deep on one will always outperform the student who goes superficially on multiples. So let's not set our kids up for failure. Also, the question suggests a 2-part response. That would be the first half of the essay, and of course down here would be part 2 of the essay. Will that student do well? No, they will not. Why? Because the student who does this will outperform them. It's very simple. Student who does that will outperform the poor kid who did version 1, because tackling why immediately demonstrates higher level thinking. And you merely show, as you wrestle with the analysis, you will show the depth to which you know those characters. The question itself is the wrong way around. It's inviting poor quality responses because it's inviting lower order thinking skills. endless description never demonstrates understanding. It merely demonstrates the production of knowledge. And to wrestle and demonstrate those things that we've talked about earlier in the early webinars, justification and evaluation and inference and discernment and perceptiveness and insightfulness, you need to be here, not there. So how could we improve these questions to help our own students in the classroom? So, well, you could make those two sentences, the original two. Let's just get the original one back up on the board here. That was version 1. We could make them one sentence. So we could say something like this. Which is where we were before. Describing a character in depth as you do so. You have now made two sentences more concise. That's version 2. Well, let's keep going because you can make this better still. That's being more concise. Second thing you could do is you could request precision in the answer and even eliminate some of the ambiguity that's still there in that question. So here we go. You could say, using detailed examples. Explain how relating to a character helped you understand a novel better. Now that's much more concise, and it's also more focused as a question. Because here's the problem. If at the top here you said, explain why being able to relate to a character or individual is important to the novel as a whole. Yes, but what does that mean, that phrase? Does that mean the novel as a whole and its popularity? Does that mean the novel as a whole and the degree in which the novelist was able to influence society? Does it mean the novel as a whole and its actual readability? Does it mean the novel as a whole and its success as a piece of literature? You see, there's multiple ways you can go here. Was it about the message? Is it about the readability? Is it about the market reach? What is it? But you don't know because it's not qualified. Now we've qualified it. Helped us understand the novel or the novel's message or purpose better. See, it's missing a word. And you can keep just tightening this question all the time. Here, now let's introduce some position. We talked about position all week. Here we go. The more we can relate to characters, and I quite like this one, the better we understand novels. Discuss. Now, if I was going to use this in a class, and that's very close to the sort of question that I quite like to use, I would just preface it with this, write a 700-word response to the following. And it's done. That question has focus, has engagement, has positional strength. And a student can work with that. You can do better though. Because once you've got students actually working around with position, you can be more engaging and actually quite challenging. Here we go. The most effective novels have the most relatable characters. Now, if I want to get under a student's skin, I would do this. And that simple addition right there has made the question more powerful. The most effective novels always have the most relatable characters, and immediately the student who wants to propel themselves will go, I'm not sure about that, miss or sir. And you go, good, prove it. That'll work. And so will this, because I'd like you finally to try this work to be even more contentious with your students around question design. You will start to pull better answers, because ironically, it's often the student who argues the counter position who scores the highest marks once we get to the senior years in education, because it's harder to do it. It demands the highest level thinking. You can't convincingly argue. Think about it like this. You actually can't convincingly argue the counter position unless you fully understand the original. That's why it works. That's why it's one of the great demonstrations of higher order thinking. So if you want to get kids used to this, get students familiar with this sorts of approaches, and again, hone and sharpen their thinking and their writing skills, start asking questions like this. Get them out of bed. Here we go. See if I can do it on the fly. Yeah. I'll just grab I'll write a copy. Having a relatable character does absolutely nothing to a novel's effectiveness. Here's another one. Message is never just about character. In fact, characters get in the way. Discuss. And now the student actually wants to start to think about this stuff, can start to think, and they go, yeah, you know what? I'm a boy. I'm reading Pride and Prejudice. I don't relate at all to the main character, to Mr. Darcy, or to the other books, or to any of the others. But I get the message. And actually, the characters had nothing to do with how powerful the message was to change me as a person or society. And you can start to be more inflammatory and more aggressive with your question positioning, and you'll help your students. Okay. I hope that's helped. I think that's enough for today. We might tackle some of this tomorrow as we start to look at advanced paragraph design and writing paragraphs in particular that demonstrate critical analysis. Because I'd like to show you some of this. Oh, but wait, no wait, there was one more thing. Don't leave just yet. I did want to talk to you about this one last thing before we left. Tomorrow we'll look at advanced paragraph structures that demonstrate, as I said, critical analysis skills, because those sorts of questions, you want that. So how can a student write critically, concisely, in very short amounts of words? And that's what I want to do tomorrow. But today I wanted to leave you with this one last thought, because I had some questions about it last week from people, and they asked me, they said, Ian, are there in particular better orders in which to write your paragraph structures? And that's a fair enough question. So I thought, yes, let's actually talk about that. That's important. And I wanted to respond to that question in particular. So let me just offer you a couple of suggestions. And again, this will help those of you who know the paragraph structures taught in Midas Toolbox and mine. And if you're casting essays, there are some useful things to do. Here's a helpful thing to do. So if the student begins with an introduction, that's great. Where could you go next? A very reliable paragraph to go next is the lawyer. That's great. The lawyer paragraph is helpful. Where do you go after the lawyer paragraph? And a big favorite of mine is, especially as you're trying to train students' thinking skills, is after the lawyer, you get them to write the compare-contrast paragraph. Why? Well, that's because English teachers out there who I have not yet offended, and there probably was quite a few so far today. No, I'm very sorry if I have. I often talk about students stepping outside of the text, and the compare contrast paragraph in its dynamic form that brings in, that synthesizes material from different parts, allows that. It allows the students to step outside and bring in material from outside the text, how this relates to society, to other scenarios, to other texts, to other works. And that's why it works quite well here. You establish the base here. And the lawyer does this firmly, and then you can step outside the compare contrast. That works quite nicely. And I do, another firm favorite of mine is, after you've done that, is you just load up a hammer paragraph. And this, the lovely ability of the hammer paragraph to come in with the element of surprise and get you there, because it is the inductive form of the paragraph that has that built-in element of suspense, which is always so much easier to spell than surprise, works. I like that structure. It's a great structure. It does work. And then if you want, you can, before you hit the conclusion, you can again bring in, you could go two ways, and both will work depending on, of course, what you're trying to do with the material. But the lawyer will work again here, even if you're doing a discussion paragraph and again looking at how these elements are connected, that will still work. Or another compare contrast. That paragraph also will work nicely as a paragraph that allows the synthetic, how these things here are actually all connected. So there's multiple choices, and it's the lovely thing as you teach the student a number of paragraph forms. This is in no way the golden solution. There are multiple combinations. And why? Because in writing, like in design, form follows function. And depending on what you're trying to do, depending on your purpose, you choose the paragraph form that allows you to discharge your purpose and complement it. And that's why you make those sorts of decisions. Okay, that's enough for one day. I've gone on a wee bit, but look, I hope that's been helpful. And it's been lovely to spend some time together. And I look forward to seeing you tomorrow when we begin to look at advanced paragraph forms and how to write critically and analytically at that higher end. Look forward to seeing you then.